So I'm going to teach you how to insert a standard zip. And I have to say, being a sewing teacher of many years, I have witnessed and seen multiple ways in which you can insert a zip. So just because I'm teaching you to do it this way doesn't mean that other ways aren't just as valid and that this way is necessarily the best. It's just the way that I like to teach if you've never done a zip before. So what we've got here is a standard zip, and I've got an example of some fabric. So what we will be doing is stitching this zip between these two layers to create a zip opening. So one of the things I like to teach my students in class is how to get the perfect zip if you've never sewn one before. So what I'm going to do first and foremost is I am going to take note of some of the important markings and the measurements of my zip. So we've discussed how important it is to retain the top of this tab because actually this will be incorporated into the seam allowance of the garment. So we're going to assume that this seam allowance for what we're making here is 5/8 or 1.5 centimeters. So I'm going to mark that on my fabric. Okay. And this is where we would want to place the stoppers, just underneath that bit, which means that I might also want to mark on the zip where the raw edge is likely to meet. Okay, it's a bit fiddly. I'm just going to do that just to help with my sort of visual aid there. I'm then going to kind of go all the way down to the stopper. And I'm going to mark just above where the stopper is going to be. So the stopper will finish underneath in this seam allowance here. So so they are the key markings that I need to pay attention to. The reason why I've decided to mark it is because what I'm going to do is I'm going to run a standard stitch on the assumption that this maybe is like a skirt, and this will be running down to the hemline, and I'm going to reinforce that here because we're going to have a lot of pull on the bottom of the zip, so we want that to be really reinforced with lots of reverse stitches. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to also run a basting stitch. So basting stitch is the longest stitch length on your running stitch, and I'm going to run that basting stitch from the top of the fabric just to about 5 mil from this end point here, and I'll explain why in a second. So I'm going to go and do that now, and I'll come back and do the next bit. Okay, so it's probably a little bit hard to see unless you're really up close, but this stitch here is your standard stitch, and this is the basting. Now what I've done is I've cut the tail threads off because the tail threads quite often get in the way, and if they get caught up in your coils, it can be quite tricky to remove. So I have got rid of those. Now what I'm going to do is I'm now going to press out or press open the seam allowance, and what's I guess important to note at this point is that we will be stitching the tabs or the tapes onto the seam allowance itself. So going back right to the very beginning of this course, I spoke about how the seam allowance refers to two different things. The first is the distance between the raw edge of the fabric and the stitching line, and then the second is this bit of fabric that's left over. So in this instance, when I say stitch this to the seam allowance, we are referring to that little bit of fabric, not the distance. Okie dokie, right, so that's nice and secure. So the reason why I like to baste or teach students to baste it before we do any sewing is basically to stop the fabric from shifting. So if we have sewn up to here and we've kept these 2 bits of seam allowances loose, there's a good chance that the fabric will shift and get sewn in wonky, which means you end up with things puckering at the bottom and misaligning at the top, and we want to avoid that. So I've deliberately done a basting stitch just to help students. So I'm gonna just remark now the seam allowance from the top, because I was working with the wrong side of the fabric, and now we've pressed that open. So I'm going to draw a line where we are going to be placing our zip, and I'm going to just very quickly open the top, or very slightly open the top, just so I know where we're going. Okay, so I've placed the coils just underneath that seam allowance. Now what we're going to need to do, and it's quite important we get this right, is we are going to now pin this to our seam allowance, but just the seam allowance. It's really important that we don't end up pinning this with the right side of the garment also incorporated, because that will mean that you'll have a visible stitching line, and this zip we're going to try and do without any sort of visible stitching line. Okay, so I'm going to run the coils down this seam allowance edge, and I'm going to pin this into position. And at this point, I guess it's also really important to explain that I'm going to be pinning vertically up the zip tape rather than horizontally, and that's because we're going to need to run a couple of stitches, basting stitches, to keep this in place. And it's very difficult to do if the pins are sitting horizontally. So that is sitting fine. I'm going to pin the other side, and then I'll take it to the sewing machine and show you what to do next. Okay, so I have in front of me a zip foot, and what's wonderful about this zip foot is, well, there's a couple of things that are wonderful. First of all, it has 2 bars. So quite often I find that students try and insert this onto their sewing machine in the middle, and it's actually not designed to be in the middle. It's either going to be on the left hand side or on the right hand side, so you can get really close to your zip coils. Here, these little divots is where your needle will go. There's also this front section here, which is designed to run against the coils, so you should have a nice straight line of stitching. And then on the underside, and this I think is my favourite bit, you've kind of got these ridges, and these ridges are designed to go on top of the coils. I don't know if you can see that there. So you can get a really clean stitch all the way down when you are inserting your zip. So I think this is one of my favourite feet, this one. So I'm going to insert it onto the sewing machine, and then I'm going to show you how to use it. Right, so I've attached the foot, and I've attached it to the left hand side. And the rule when it comes to zip feet is that if you are working on the right hand side of your tape, you want it on the left hand side, and if you're working with the left hand side of your tape, you want it on the right hand side. Now there are ways in which you can turn the sewing around, so you don't actually have to change the positioning of your foot, but there's lots of flexibility with this foot, and it really is a preference thing. So you would have noticed that if I'm going to be working on this right hand side piece first, so you will be able to see that I have pinned with the pin head at the bottom and the pins going outwards, and that's because I need to take these pins out as I'm sewing. Okie dokie. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm not actually going to place the zip foot right over the coils. I am going to just place it alongside, because I'm going to want to baste this into position before I even start stitching. Now, as you get better and quicker at sewing, you won't need to do these basting stitches, but I always think it's a good idea, if you've not done a zip before, or if you want a really accurate zip, just run a basting stitch in first, and then you can come in, take those pins out and get a really accurate stitch. Right, so I've got my machine ready. I'm on basting stitch, and I'm going to just wind the stitching on with my foot. I'm going to do a little reverse stitch just because I want to make sure that everything's in place, and I'm going to baste this on, removing the pins as I go. Keep that nice and secure. Another reverse stitch there. So that side is basted on. I'm going to do the other side, and then I'm going to show you the impact that that has had. Okay, so now I've basted the zip into position. What I'm going to do is take out the original basting stitches that I did to keep the fabric seam allowance together. So I did a couple of reverse stitches just to hold it all in place. So I'm going to remove that, and hopefully it'll come up quite easily. Yep, there we go. And the idea now is that what we're able to do is turn this back to the right side and see where the zip is, and that is sitting beautifully. So we're now going to go back to the sewing machine and we're going to stitch this into position. Okay, so this is what I was talking about. That's all been basted in. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold the garment right side to right side, because I'm going to be stitching here. Now, I am deliberately starting my stitching underneath where that tab is. So I'm going to start about here and work my way down. I'll finish this bit off in a bit, but I'm going to place my foot so it's over the coils, and you won't be able to see the coils, but you'll be able to feel them. Okay, so you might want to do a little bit of adjusting. There we go. So if I run my finger down there, hopefully you'll be able to see a small ridge where the coils are, and this part of the foot is running up against the edge of the coils, and the coils are running underneath that foot. Okay, so I'm going to start by setting my machine to normal stitch length, and I'm going to do a couple of stitches forward with my hand, and I'm going to do some reverse stitches, and I'm just going to run that down, and I'm just going to follow the feel of the fabric and the feel of the coils, because the zip is actually doing all the work for you. The pins aren't there because we've basted, and this should give you a very easy job. And I'm going to run it down past the top of the seam allowance there. I don't know if you can see that. There we go. So I'm going to do the other side. And again, you can change your foot over to the right hand side, or you can, as I've just done, turn the whole thing around and go from the bottom upwards. So I'm going to start about here-ish, placing the coils underneath the foot and this up against the edge, and away I go. Okay, and I'm stopping just before I hit the tab, so the tab's there. I don't want to sew past it, because what I'm going to have to do is either sew at an angle or pull the zip down itself, and we'll do a version of that zip insertion at a later date. Okay, so that's now been stitched in. So I'm going to take out these basting stitches. I'm going to show you the impact that this has had. Right, okay, so this has now been done. It's sewn close to the coils. We've just got this bit to finish off. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up that zip tab now, and then like before I'm going to overlay the garment right side to right side. So I'm just working on the seam allowance and the zip tape, and I'm going to realign it, and I'm going to place a pin there just to stop it from shifting. So I'm going to place this back in the machine, and I'm going to again make sure that the coil is running against this line and under that little channel there. Okay, so I'm going to wind my needle on, do a couple of reverse stitches, take this pin out now, and then I'm just going to pick up this stitching line here. And again, do a couple of reverse stitches just to hold that all in place, and voila, that is done. So I'll do the other side and then I'll show you the finished result. So this is the finished article. So I like this zip because it's so close and the fabric almost hovers over the coil, which means that you get a really neat, beautiful finish. So that's a way in which you can sew a zip. You do have many other ways, and I will teach you lots of different varieties of this, but this is how I teach students who have never sewn a zip before, and it's a surefire way to make sure that you get a nice alignment at the top and no puckering at that seam line.